The day Eleanor Whitmore pushed her father-in-law into the open, merciless blue of the Atlantic, she believed she was finally taking control of a legacy she felt had been unfairly denied to her. A legacy she thought belonged to her by proximity, by marriage, by entitlement, and by the pale illusion of superiority she had carried like a birthright her entire life. And as the wind tore through her hair and the salt stung her eyes, she watched Harold Whitmore, her husband's black father, disappear beneath the churning waves with a satisfaction so cold it surprised even her, because Eleanor had spent years convincing herself that Harold was an obstacle, a living reminder of a past her husband, James, rarely spoke about, a man who represented everything she believed did not fit into the polished future she envisioned, the kind of future lined with marble floors, country club memberships, and a trust fund inheritance she was certain James deserved but feared would never fully materialize as long as Harold remained alive, breathing, and legally in control of the estate left behind by James's late mother. A woman Eleanor had never met but resented deeply, because that woman, a black civil rights attorney named Ruth Whitmore, had been brilliant, principled, and fiercely protective of the fortune she built from nothing, and she had written a will that reflected values Eleanor found infuriating, clauses about community trusts, scholarships, and stipends that ensured Harold would manage the wealth until his death, with James receiving only what Ruth believed he needed, not what Eleanor believed she wanted. And Eleanor told herself again and again that she was not racist, that it was not about color, not really, but about competence, about who fit the image of stewardship. Yet every argument she had ever made against Harold was laced with assumptions, microaggressions, and quiet contempt, the kind that hid behind smiles at family dinners and passive-aggressive comments about culture and background. And Harold had always seen through her, his eyes calm, observant, tired, like a man who had survived far worse than Eleanor's venom and knew it would eventually expose itself. And when James suggested a weekend yacht trip to clear their heads, after another explosive argument about money, Eleanor saw opportunity wrapped in leisure, a private moment far from witnesses, far from accountability, and as they sailed out past the coastline, the sun glinting off the water, like shards of broken glass, Harold stood at the railing, breathing deeply, speaking softly about Ruth, about how the ocean reminded him of marches of ships, of loss and survival, and Eleanor felt something twist inside her, a resentment sharpened by fear, because Harold still held the power she craved, and in a moment she would later describe to herself as inevitable rather than chosen. She stepped forward, her voice sharp, accusing him of manipulation, of stealing his own son's future, and, when Harold turned, surprised but composed, she shoved him, hard, with both hands, telling herself it was an accident even as she watched his body tip, his eyes locking onto hers not with panic but with recognition, as if he had always known this was possible. And the splash was loud, final, swallowed quickly by the engine's hum, and Eleanor screamed, high and dramatic, calling James, insisting Harold had slipped, that it was horrible, tragic, unforeseeable, and James, pale and shaking, believed her because belief was easier than doubt, because love often blinds itself for survival, and authorities ruled it an accident, because there were no cameras, no witnesses, and the ocean does not testify, and Eleanor mourned publicly with practiced grace, wearing black linen and speaking about family and loss, while privately calculating timelines, inheritance transfers, and the soft, luxurious future she believed was now secured. But what Eleanor did not know, what she could not know, was that Harold Whitmore had not died that day, because fate, history, and endurance had other plans, and a passing fishing vessel, crewed by two Dominican brothers who knew the currents like second skin, spotted him clinging to a piece of debris hours later, barely conscious but alive, and as he recovered in a small coastal clinic under a different name, Harold made a choice that would become the first true twist in Eleanor's carefully constructed lie, because rather than announce his survival, rather than rush back to confront the woman who tried to kill him, he disappeared not out of fear but strategy, because Harold had learned long ago that systems rarely protect men like him unless they are forced to, and over the months that followed, Eleanor's life bloomed exactly as she expected and yet subtly rotted underneath, because the inheritance did not arrive as cleanly as she thought, because Ruth's will was layered with contingencies, with trustees, with ethical review boards that delayed payouts, and because James, freed from his father's quiet, grounding presence, began to unravel, drinking more, questioning less, haunted by dreams of the ocean, and eyes beneath the surface, while Eleanor grew sharper, more impatient, more openly dismissive of the very communities Ruth's money supported, cutting funding, redirecting resources, making enemies she didn't notice because she believed herself untouchable. And then, 3 years later, on a humid August evening, at a gala celebrating philanthropy and progress, Eleanor stood at a podium accepting an award she had essentially bought, smiling for cameras, when she saw a man in the back of the room whose posture, whose stillness, whose eyes froze her blood mid-vein, because there he was, older, thinner, grayer, but unmistakable Harold Whitmore, alive, watching her with a calm so profound it felt like judgment itself, and Eleanor faltered, her speech collapsing into silence, and before she could recover, Harold stepped forward, not raising his voice, not causing a scene, simply asking, "May I speak?" And the room, sensing gravity, parted, and what followed was not an accusation but a revelation, as Harold spoke of survival, of betrayal, of a system that believed a polished lie over an inconvenient truth, and as screens lit up behind him with evidence Eleanor never knew existed. Financial records, emails, altered documents, proof that Ruth had anticipated threats not only from institutions but from within her own family, and that she had installed safeguards that would activate only if Harold disappeared under suspicious circumstances, transferring investigative authority to independent legal teams, and as the crowd gasped, James stood, shaking, realizing the truth not as a single blow but as 1,000 small cuts, memories reassembling themselves into a picture he could no longer deny, and Eleanor tried to flee but found exits blocked by security, by law enforcement, by the weight of her own actions finally solidified into consequence. And the final twist came not with Eleanor's arrest, though that followed swiftly, but with Harold's announcement that he would not reclaim the inheritance for himself, that he would dissolve the estate into the community trusts Ruth envisioned, ensuring that the wealth born of struggle would serve those still fighting, leaving James with a choice, not of money, but of who he would become. And as Eleanor was led away, screaming about betrayal, about rights, about how this was not how it was supposed to end, Harold looked at her one last time and said softly, "The sea gives back what it chooses." And years later, long after, headlines faded and Eleanor's name became shorthand for disgrace, people would still tell the story of the woman who thought she could bury truth in the ocean, and the man who rose anyway, because some legacies cannot be stolen, some voices cannot be drowned, and justice, like the tide, always returns.